So welcome, friends. I'm Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitude Center Zoom session with our very special guest today, Jonathan Montaldo. You can find many other great upcoming Zooms at www.beatitudecenter.org. First, let me remind everyone to please mute yourselves and to write out any questions, and lots of questions, for our guest speaker in the chat link. Hoping Jonathan will speak about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments for 45 minutes. So please bring a question for Jonathan. And later we will send out the Zoom recording link. And so let's begin with a little prayer. As we're in this Holy Advent season, I invite everybody just to take a deep breath and enter into a moment of silence and peace, to let everything go, all your busyness and issues and problems and works, and enter into the Advent spirit of peace and waiting and longing for God. And though we're talking about Thomas Merton, we're really talking about God today. So as we enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves each one of you infinitely, we welcome the nonviolent Jesus in our hearts. And let's take a moment and ask for all the Advent graces, peace and light and hope and love. Beloved God, thank you for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us. Be with us this Advent as we reflect with our friend Jonathan on Thomas Merton and your Advent call to peace and hope and prayer, as we prepare anew for the life of the nonviolent Jesus and his call to follow him, that we might do our part to welcome his Christmas gift of peace on earth, that we might help you end war and racism and poverty and gun violence, nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, and every form of violence. And we pray that you be with us and strengthen us, inspire us, energize us, send us forth that we might do your will and live out your beatitudes and speak out and take action for peace, that we might be your holy Christmas people who welcome your gift of universal peace on earth. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. My friends and I have, including Jonathan and Ken Budigan and others who are on the Zoom today, have been studying Thomas Merton our whole lives and consider him a great teacher and spiritual guide and inspiration. And I know millions of others think that too. And I was thinking this morning, I don't know what life would be without the writings and witness of Thomas Merton. He fills such an unusual place for all spiritual seekers. I've been reading him regularly for 50 years now, and I've been so blessed, like Jonathan and others, to go to the Abbey of Gethsemane throughout my whole life and to count his friends as my friends, and to have so many friends who love Merton. And as I wrote in the e-blast about this, I've always thought of Merton's life as one long Advent. Isn't that interesting? It always struck me that way. I think because he entered on December 10th in Advent, 1941, right after Pearl Harbor. Think about that. Such a dramatic thing to do in response to Pearl Harbor. And he died on the same day, December 10th, 1968, also in Advent. But I think part of it is because the monastic life, living in a monastery, is like living a permanent Advent life of prayer and hope. Jonathan, the other day I came across a great Thomas Merton quote, his definition of Advent, which I'd never seen before. Here it is. Advent is the beginning of the end of all that is in us that is not of Christ. How does he think that? I got to say that again. Advent is the beginning of the end of all that is in us that is not of Christ. I think that's beautiful. I think I would widen it to say not just personally, but the whole human race. So it's a real blessing to have with us all today, one of the greatest Merton scholars reflecting with us, and this is my friend Jonathan Montaldo. Jonathan, I'll introduce him and then we can welcome him, is a writer, editor, and a retreat presenter, and served as director of the Thomas Merton Center at Bellarmine University in Louisville, Kentucky, which is the official archives of Thomas Merton. He was later the associate director for the Merton Institute for Contemplative Living in Louisville, Kentucky, where he's coming from to us today. And that's where he created this 10-booklet resource for small groups called Bridges to Contemplative Living with Thomas Merton. He also served as the director of Bethany Spring, the Merton Institute's retreat center, 1 mile from Merton's monastery, the Abbey of Gethsemane. So Jonathan edited, I'm going to hold it up, I hope you can all see it here, the second volume of Merton's 7 volumes of journals. This one is Entering the Silence, volume 2, 1941 to 1952. So it's the first decade of Merton's life. And he edited that with the actual journals. Then he co-edited with our friend Brother Patrick Hart the kind of great collection of the best parts of the whole 7-volume series of Merton's journals. This is called The Intimate Merton, His Life from His Journals. And it's one of my absolute all-time favorite books. And if you want a really great new Merton book that you haven't read, get this. It's kind of Merton's greatest hits from his journal. Another one of my absolute favorite books that Jonathan co-edited, is We Are Already One. I hope you can see this. Thomas Merton's Message of Hope, Reflections to Honor His Centenary. So this came out for Merton's 100th birthday, and it has short essays by about 100 Merton scholars and friends. And it's also one of my favorite books in the world. Jonathan edited a bunch of other nice little Merton books. I'll hold up one, which I like, Choosing to Love the World. And Jonathan, I don't know if you know this, but Pema Chodron uses this and teaches it, which is really, really high praise. So, dear friends, I could go on and on about all Jonathan's works, but I've gone on too long. Please join me in giving a very warm, rousing welcome to our friend, Jonathan Montaldo. So let's see a show of hands. Jonathan, you're among friends here, so welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It really is a privilege and an honor to be with you, particularly to be with Father John Deere. I hope that you can hear me well. I'm just getting over COVID. I have had it for 5 weeks, and I'm no longer positive. So I'm still in something of a fog, but I'm very glad to be with you. And I want to begin my comments by reading to you something that I have written particularly for our meeting today. And I've given it the title, Thomas Merton's Advent Spiritual Exercises of Resistance and Protest. I am a distracted, superficially self-conscious person who serves too many masters. I facilely speak and write about contemplative living while pursuing other things, scratching the itch to see my name in print and securing the comforts of a privileged life, to name just 2 incompatible desires to becoming a contemplative. Our earth burns and its waters rise, but the animal animosity within me against those not washed in the blood of my small tribe breeds an inner war against peace and all good that affects my behavior. Lately, the myths that warn of a coming apocalypse of judgment upon our human species evolutionary experiment keep me awake. Is there a center within me, a center within all of us together that will hold? In his book, Raised on the unspeakable, Thomas Merton described the 1960s as a time of no room. His words back then remain even more prophetic to our human condition today. He wrote, "We live in a time of no room, which is the time of the end, a time when everyone is obsessed with lack of time and space, with projecting onto time and space the anguish produced within us by the technological furies of size, volume, quantity, speed, number, price, power, and acceleration." He foresaw from the 1960s a time was coming when we would bottle and sell our rainwater, when we would be identified by digital numbers. He wrote, "We are numbered in billions and massed together, marched here and there, taxed, armed, worked to the point of insensibility, dazed by information, drugged by entertainment, surfeited with everything, nauseated with humans and with ourselves, nauseated with life." Toning down his outrage, he wrote, "As the end approaches, there is no room for contemplative quiet. There is no room for solitude. There is no room for thought. There is no room for attention, for the awareness of our state. Out of this unutterable void of our mind and heartlessness come the armies, the missiles, the weapons, the bombs, the concentration camps, the race riots, the racist murders, and all the other crimes of mass society." Advent ascetical spiritual exercises require my resistance and non-compliance with whatever forces I have injected into myself that prevent me from learning to become a more fully self-conscious human being. Contemplation, as I read Merton reads it, is authentic if it produces within my inner experiences an ascetical resistance to any tendency within me that surrenders my integrity and personal human dignity to the same cultural forces that deny the integrity and the dignity of other living beings. Contemplative, ascetical, spiritual exercises are antidotes that pacify my ever-present inner conflicts. Let's call them my passions, that distract me from focusing on the one thing necessary, adoring God by becoming more capable for serving and even loving my neighbors. Now, I want you to pay attention to this next paragraph. It's extremely important. And it's from Merton. Contemplative, ascetical, spiritual exercises help me find my own struggling path to experiencing an inner freedom, which Merton described thus: freedom from control that is not in some way imminent and personal for me to exercise the power of love. Religious belief in this higher sense is always a liberation from control by what is less than human or entirely exterior to the human person. Whoever receives the grace of this kind of religious illumination is given a freedom and an experience which leave them no longer completely subject to the forces of nature, to their bodily and emotional needs, to the merely external dictates of society. The religious person's attitude to life seeks to be independent of the power inevitably exercised over them by natural forces, by the trials and accidents of life, by the pressures of a not always rational collectivity. In Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, Merton again asserted that authentic religion inspires human freedom. Freedom from domination, freedom to live one's own spiritual life, freedom to seek the highest truth, unabashed by any human pressure or collective demand, the ability to say one's own yes and one's own no, and not merely to echo the yes and no of the state, the party, the corporation, an army, or a system. My most authentic humanity is forged in communal relationships that give a room for all to work on restoring their personal integrity and human dignity. In the church of our friends, we learn that the room to exercise freedom is within a school of charity where everyone learns to first do no harm to any being, and then to help alleviate all the harm being done to our neighbors, especially those too poor and beaten down to speak out. Now, in this time of Advent, I should practice being sober and watchful, protesting and resisting unserious distractions that make false claims on my inner experiences. A continuing contemplative examination of my conscience in solitude and with others should produce in me a compassion for all those with whom my personal existence becomes shared. I can prepare for an eschatological experience of universal love by aligning myself with communities who offer workshops where we learn how to live, to enact mutual care, and however imperfectly, give us opportunities to learn how to love. I agree with John that Merton's monastic life could be construed as one long Advent. But I want to nuance that a little bit. Advent was certainly his life's most poignant liturgical season, and he wrote waiting for the coming gestation of Christ in his life. Advent, it could be said, marked his beginning and his end. Here's what he wrote in his journals on this very date, December 9th, in 1962. It is beautiful Advent weather, grayish and cold, with clouds of light snow howling across the valley. I put some bread out for the birds. 21 years tomorrow, December 10th, since I landed here. The Advent hymns sound as they first did, as if they were the nearest things to me that ever were. As if these hymns had been decisive in shaping my life. As if I had received their form. As if there could never be any other melodies so deeply connatural to me The Rorate Caeli brought me here to pray for peace. These Advent hymns are me, the words, the melodies, everything. When he wrote this prayer that I'm about to relate to you, Merton had been in the monastery for 2 weeks. He was saying a Latin breviary, however, so he was celebrating all of Latin, of Advent by the Latin office, and particularly all these Advent prayers. On the last day of Advent in 1941, in December when he came, Christmas Eve, he writes this prayer in his journals. Lord, it is nearly midnight, and I am waiting for you in the darkness and the great silence. I'm sorry for all my sins. Do not let me ask any more than to sit in the darkness and light no lights of my own, and be crowded with no crowds of my own thoughts to fill the emptiness of the night in which I await you. In order to remain in the sweet darkness of pure faith, let me become nothing to the pale, weak light of sense. As to the world, let me become totally obscure from it forever. Thus, through this darkness, may I come to your brightness at last. Having become insignificant to the world, may I reach out towards the infinite meanings contained in your peace and your glory. Your brightness is my darkness. I know nothing of you, and by myself I cannot even imagine how to go about knowing you. If I imagine you, I am mistaken. If I understand you, I am deluded. If I am conscious and certain that I know you, I'm crazy. The darkness is enough. This prayer reveals a principal theme of Merton's monastic contemplative life. He is realizing that he must remove his ordinary self-consciousness through which he argues with the 7 guys who argue inside his head. He must open himself to another voice with the face of peace, a peace he knows he cannot give to himself. Merton's faith in a religious destiny for his life was essentially eschatological. His faith was an Advent faith. In his autobiography, he wrote, in some sense, we are always traveling as if we did not know where we were going. But in another sense, we know by grace that we have already arrived at our destination. But oh, how far I have to go to find you, my God, in whom I have already arrived. Merton's eschatological Advent faith was supported by spiritual exercises that kept his consciousness open, that he had to always be journeying forward to a fullness of reality that for him was experienced always as a not yet. I'm shuffling the paper. Hold on. My mother said, "Are you all following me?" That's what she would have said. "Are you following me?" Here I am.
Yes, you're doing great. Keep going.
The fog of COVID. Someone can hear a prayer like this and think, "Oh, this is navel gazing." You know, this kind of inner work is essentially selfish, and one should be just simply serving the poor, serving in soup kitchens, teaching young people, building a school for lost kids in Haiti. But Merton, in my estimation, would say that without this inner work of contemplation, without getting to know ourselves, our passions, and resisting whatever in us keeps us from serving our neighbors, contemplation becomes absolutely essential in tandem to service. Here's what Merton wrote in introduction to his literature translated into Spanish. Contemplation cannot construct a new world by itself. Contemplation does not feed the hungry. It does not clothe the naked. And it does not return the sinner to peace, truth, and union with God. But without contemplation, we cannot see what we do. Without contemplation, we cannot understand the significance of the world in which we must act. Without contemplation, we remain small, limited, divided, partial. We adhere to the insufficient, permanently united to our narrow group and its interest, losing sight of justice and charity, seized by the passions of the moment. Without contemplation, without the intimate, silent, secret pursuit of my truth through love, our action loses itself in the world and becomes dangerous. Unless we are doing ascetical, spiritual exercises on who it is we are, who it is we have become, at whatever stage of human life we're at, unless we integrate and love what we have become, we cannot give peace and love to others. St. Thomas Aquinas said it a long time ago. You cannot give what you don't have. If you are not nonviolent with yourself, you cannot teach nonviolence to others. Others will see your nonviolence, your violence. And if you are nonviolent, you do not have to open your mouth. Daniel Berrigan, Father Daniel Berrigan, Society of Jesus, came to the Thomas Merton Center when I was the director there. And he said something that floored me. He said, it was Merton who radicalized me. It was Merton who sent me out to be a sign for nonviolence in this world. Daniel Berrigan was younger than Thomas Merton was. And I think that he admired Merton very much, but he was very different from Thomas Merton. Daniel Berrigan, to my mind, was a Jesuit, a contemplative in action. There was a book that was based on a film called Soul Searching, the Journey of Thomas Merton. This film was done by the filmmaker Morgan Atkinson. And I worked with him in transcribing some of these interviews that he gave with people who knew Thomas Merton. Interviews with John Deere are there, and interviews with Daniel Berrigan are in this film. And Daniel Berrigan says something that I think is so illustrative of this different way of perceiving oneself as a contemplative. I want to quote this to you. And this is Daniel Berrigan speaking. Merton had this image of a monk as being someone on the margins, at the edge, he would say. Well, I came to think that this was not the image I had about, let's say, my place in the scheme of things. I thought maybe his work, and mine as well, was not to look upon ourselves as at the edge of anything. We were creating a new center. We were where the gospel required us to be, and the people who were giving in to violence as a Christian value, they were the people on the edge, not me. It was very clear to me and to Merton and to my friends that Christ was calling us to love our enemies and to do good to those who did ill to us. Peter, put up your sword. Blessed are the peacemakers, not the war makers. I agree with Berrigan that Merton thought of himself as a marginal person. He was marginal to the center of American culture. And therefore, this was his contemplation, to perceive where he was and where we all were in the center of American culture, that we find so terribly wanting. Berrigan's totally different. He says, I'm not on the edge of anything. I'm creating a new center. Berrigan wanted to be in the traffic. Merton did not. In his journals, these are late in his journals, he says, I've got to get out of the traffic. I've got to get out of the liturgical renewal traffic, the Zen Buddhist traffic, the peace movement traffic. If he had told that to Berrigan, or Berrigan read it, and I'm just projecting, I would assume Berrigan said, no, darling, you're in a different kind of traffic, but you're in the traffic and you can't get out. And I'm in another kind of traffic and I don't want to get out. This is where my action is. And now I'm going to end my formal part by reading the end of a paper that I did about Merton finding his true voice, uncaging his voice, being able to speak in his own voice. He said that when he was a young monk and he wrote things like The Seven-Story Mountain and New Seas of Contemplation and No Man is an Island, he said, I was writing as I thought monks should write. As he grew in the monastic life, as he grew in his contemplative life, he began to speak in his own way. To not speak to the image of monks that people had in the 1950s and 60s. And remember, that image is not the image we have of monks today. The monks that are living today are not in the same world as Merton was in the 1950s, the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It's another reality. Here's how I end this, and it's sort of a summing up of my praise for Thomas Merton. On the last day of Merton's life, December 10th, 1968, when he delivered a talk on Marxism and monasticism, Merton related for his institutionalized monastic colleagues the advice given to a Tibetan Lama going into exile after the Chinese invasion. From now on, brother, everybody stands on his own 2 feet. Merton then remarked how important a monastic statement this was and suggested that everyone present remember it for the future. He then said, "This, I think, is what Buddhism is about, what Christianity is about, what monasticism is about, if you understand it in terms of grace. It is a statement to the effect that we can no longer rely on being supported by structures that may be destroyed at any moment by political power or a political force. You cannot rely on structures. The time for relying on structures has disappeared. They are good. Structures should help us, and we should do the best we can with them, but they can be taken away." And here's the koan. But they can be taken away. And if every structure is taken away, what do you do next? Merton's final advice to his colleagues, that they stand on their own 2 feet, synchronizes with an observation he had made earlier in his article entitled "A Theology of Creativity," where he had asserted that, quote, "the dignity of the private person is to stand before God on their own feet, alive, conscious, and alert to the light that has been placed in them, and then become perfectly obedient to that light." Paul Evdokimov, the Eastern Orthodox theologian, has written that, quote, "a saint is striking because of a countenance unique in the world, because of a light that is always ultimately personal. A saint is he or she who has never been seen before." Thomas Merton's countenance, too, has never been seen before. Merton's meaning and his message were always personal. He will have no successors. He wrote in his journal, very important, quote, "My vocation and task in this world is to keep alive all that is usefully individual and personal to me, thus becoming a contemplative in the full sense, sharing my contemplation with others, remaining as a singular witness to the nobility of the private person and the primacy of the private person over the group." Merton's vocation to love the world by speaking out to it courageously, his vocation to listen intently as the world spoke back, and his life's urgency to live in peace and nonviolence are his enduring legacies for us. We who read his words today will honor their continuing power for our own times by living out our own personal paths to peace. Finding our own ways to witness to the truth is more important than any vows we are tempted to make to a dead spiritual master. Say that again. Finding our ways, our own ways to witness to the truth is more important than any vows we are tempted to make to a dead spiritual master. Honoring Merton's legacy for us demands that we stand on our own 2 feet, and finding the true pitch of our own singular tones of honest voice, open our lips and sing. Now, before we open this up to reflections or questions, I want to say something that may be personally embarrassing to dear Father John Deere, dear John Deere. John Deere has had many mentors in his. What? No, I'm sorry. I'm moving. I'm going ahead. John Deere has had many mentors in his life, chief of whom I would think would be Daniel Gurdon. But John Deere has not made 10,000 vows to his dead master, but he has stood on his own 2 feet, and he has sung in his own voice. John Deere could be superficially criticized that he's wrote 40 books and they're all about nonviolence and peace. Yes. Unlike Merton, who spread himself very, very thin, writing about this, that, John Deere has continued in season and out as a young man and now as a middle ager to speak of the one thing necessary. I have read the introduction to his latest book, The Gospel of Peace, a commentary on Matthew, Mark, and Luke from the perspective of nonviolence. It's fabulous, and I recommend it to you. And so I am extremely honored to have been invited by John Deere to speak to you about Thomas Merton. And in speaking about someone who finds their own voice and stands on their own 2 feet, in my case, I have fallen to the weak knees of my heart and tried to hum along.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It was so beautiful. Hey, everybody, how about a show of hands for our teacher this morning? Jonathan, that was so beautiful. I think I speak for everybody. We could all just listen to you all day because you speak with such authority and also from the heart. In my notes, I heard you talk about the time of no room. So beautiful. Contemplative, ascetical, spiritual exercises, and how that leads to inner freedom and the search for authentic humanity. The church teaching us first to do no harm and second to stop all the harm, especially to the poor. The call to eschatological universal love. Eschatological Advent faith as the way to describe Merton's faith. So beautiful. And so much about contemplation. Now, I see there's 2 questions, and I'm going to ask you to talk about Daryl's question first. I'll tell you about that. And then I want to ask a question, if that's okay. I think there's another question, and there's a lot of good friends of mine here, Jonathan, that I'd like to call on. Maybe they might have a question, and I'll give some of you a heads up. Gordon, who has written beautiful books on Merton, Ken Buddigan, Marcia Kelly, I'm going to ask you if you want to respond to Jonathan. Bob Black's his niece. Jenny, Jerry, and John Yasenchek. John was also a friend of Dan Bergen's. So let's start with my
John,
friend Daryl. Up.
yeah, but John, before I'm willing to answer questions, but I would also like people simply to say their say. You don't
Okay,
have to ask. In other words, I'm hearing this word, and here's what I say, so that we can hear other voices.
great. So if you want to jump in, let me know in the chat or raise your hand and I can call on you. Daryl, you want to ask your question of Jonathan? Go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, Jonathan, I just wondered what Merton had to say about what he wrote about the Sermon on the Mount.
Thanks, Daryl.
I don't know.
Blessed are the meek.
Good. See, John Deere knows. Blessed are the meek. Tell him, John.
No, seriously, this is what our Jonathan and I were talking the other day, and I'd love all of you. Merton never wrote about Jesus. Think about that. Gandhi, he writes 150 books, right, Jonathan? There's no book on Jesus. And in fact, in all his books, there's very little about Jesus. There's little about Jesus in his journals. Dan Berrigan never wrote about Jesus, and I used to harass him about that. Dorothy Day never did. Dr. King never did. Gandhi wrote more about Jesus than all of them combined. However, Daryl, and that's because I wrote this book on Merton. Merton wrote an essay on nonviolence that FOR asked him to write. He dedicated to Joan Baez. It's life-changing. It's because it's called Blessed Are the Meek, the Christian Roots of Nonviolence. Have you read that, Daryl? Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, that's your homework assignment. It's in either Passion of Peace or the Nonviolent Alternative, and you can find my commentary here. Merton says, and then Jonathan, unpack what I'm saying. He's been asked to write about nonviolence for the Fellowship of Reconciliation in 1966. It's a formal essay. And he begins with the third beatitude, which has led me, it's really changed my life. Blessed are the meek, they will inherit the earth. So not only does he's writing about one of the beatitudes. And Merton says, the biblical word meek is not humility, it's active nonviolence like Martin Luther King and Gandhi. And then I wrote a book later about that whole thing, saying Jesus is so weird. Jesus says active nonviolence leads to one with creation. Hello? Rejecting the nonviolence of Jesus leads to catastrophic climate change. Merton says all of that in his essay. But his essay, I've read maybe 50 times. I think it's the hardest thing he ever wrote. And maybe because it's not that well written, Jonathan. But he talks about, he's saying that it's post-doctoral Christian nonviolence. And he gets from that one sentence in the Sermon on the Mount. And that's the only thing he wrote about in the Sermon on the Mount. He never really wrote about love your enemies, per se. But it's so hard because he says things like, he's talking about eschatological hope is the basis of nonviolence. Being human is the basis of nonviolence. Anyway, he goes on in ways, and having no attachment to results is critical for this being a Sermon on the Mount person. Jonathan, what do you think? Tell us your memories of that article.
No, I can't. I don't have any memories of that article. But here's what I want to say: this eschatological hope is to act. It is to act to be worthy of the revolution that is coming. To act in your own life to be worthy of a world at peace and that is nonviolent. There's a beautiful thing that I want to read to you, and it's right on this. This is from a book which I recommend to you heartily, by Pierre Hadot, Hadot. Pierre Hadot, French, 20th century, dead. He's written beautiful things on ancient philosophy. But the book that I'm recommending is Philosophy as a Way of Life. Philosophy as a way of life. And when I read him, all I can think of is contemplation as a way of life. And he begins with this quote from someone else, George Friedman, who was French sociologist, who wrote in French. I can't find anything about him in English, but this quote that is the epigram of Hadot's book is about spiritual exercises, about contemplation. I'm quoting now. To take flight every day, at least for a moment, which may be brief as long as it is intense. A spiritual exercise every day, either alone or in the company of someone who wishes to better themselves. Spiritual exercises. Step out of duration. Try to get rid of your passions, your vanities, and the itch for talk about your own name, which sometimes burns you like a chronic disease. Avoid backbiting. Get rid of pity and hatred. Love all free human beings. Become eternal by transcending yourself. This work on yourself, he said, this inner work, this work on yourself is necessary. This ambition is justified. Lots of people let themselves be wholly absorbed by militant politics and the preparation for social revolution. Rare, much more rare, are they who, in order to prepare for the revolution, are willing to make themselves worthy of it.
That's great, Jonathan. It's just very, very lovely. It's so Gandhian too. I want to ask you or make my comment, and then I'm going to unmute or ask you, Gordon, wherever you are, to ask your question of Jonathan. So, Jonathan, I was thinking throughout your sharing about watching the Paul Wilkes movie on Merton with Daniel Berrigan about 15 years ago. And I want to tell you about it. And so from the very first day, and I hope you don't, since you ended with this point, I want to tell you what Dan said and then ask you to comment. I always consider Dan and Bob Lux to be Merton's best friends, in my opinion. And the day I first met Dan in the early 80s, he was talking that we are not on the edge, we're creating a new center. So that was a critical teaching for Merton, for Dan Berrigan. If you all haven't seen it, this incredible 1-hour PBS movie about Merton that came out in 1984 called Merton, and it's a film by Paul Wilkes, and you can watch it for free on YouTube. Go and watch it if you haven't, because he got everybody, including the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh, Joan Baez, and Dan refused to be in it. He was annoyed with Merton. He's just become an industry. So he'd really never watched it. But I'd seen that film footage of Merton's last day, a few hours before he died, begins and ends the film, where he says, as Jonathan just said, we all are on our own. We stand on our own 2 feet, can no longer rely on institutions. And I found that helpful over the last 40 years as the institutional church is collapsing all around us. I think about Merton all the time. He said, you're on your own, okay? And this is really helpful to me. So Dan came and spent a week with me the last time, let's say in 2010, about 5 years before he died. And one night I said, let's watch the Merton movie. Great. And he'd never seen it. And he's just wide-eyed. This is his friend. And we get to the end, And Merton says, there's the clip. Merton's saying, from now on, we stand on our own 2 feet. This is the essence of Buddhism, the essence of Christianity. This, no, you can't rely on instructions. And Dan jumped up and said, he's wrong. Isn't that great? And he was so passionate, he talked about it for a week. He said, Merton is wrong. Everything is going to collapse. And finally, we have to learn from the Latin American and African church. This is what Dan Berrigan said to me 10 years ago. The future is small base communities. That's how Latin Americans survived in all the wars of the 80s and 90s, base community movement. And as Dan is telling me, as the United States collapses, we're not on our own. We're going to become like the Jesus and gather a few friends around us and pray and share with one another like Dorothy Day was trying to do. That's the future. And Merton could never have understood that because he was alone. He was a loner. And Dan was so passionate about that. And I don't think I've ever told anybody this. What do you think, Jonathan?
Well, I would modify that a little bit. And Merton has just met, he's just been informed about, he's met Chongpa Rinpoche in India.
Mm-hmm.
And Chongpa Rinpoche is the one who tells him that he had to leave China with just him and his cellarer. And before he left, he called up one of the abbots and said, "What are we going to do?" He said, "I don't know, brother, but from now on, everybody's got to stand on his own 2 feet." So Merton is quoting that. But if we wanted to, if we could have expatiated, if Merton would have developed that a little bit more, I think he would have said, once you struggle to your own 2 feet, remember how you get up. You're holding another person's hand in both of yours. We're all struggling together to stand on our own 2 feet. We can't, it's not a question of independence. Merton did not like individuality. Remember, he lived in a community where they were in lockstep all the time. So I think that Dan Berrigan, it seems to me, was right to say that's not how it, we're not becoming individuals and resist and protest. And no, we resist in order to really love our neighbors, to get rid of the obstacles. And the only way we do that is to share our inner experiences with one another. This is what Merton meant, I think, when he spoke of the church of his friends. Merton, in a letter, a round robin letter that he wrote, that is included in that in the book, Thomas Merton in My Own Words. I included it because he says the institutional structures of the church mean less and less to me. I could say my real church is the church of my friends.
Wow, it's great.
The church of my friends. And I quote that. When I said, let me just repeat that again, because
it's so helpful.
It is helpful. And let me find it, okay? Just bear with me a minute.
Yeah, and while you're looking that up, Gordon, get ready. Wherever you are, Gordon.
Toward the end of what I had to say. This is me talking. My most authentic humanity. And the reason why I'm saying my and not ours, and even worse, yours, is the first person that I have to speak to is myself. Remember, I started out saying, I live a distracted, superficially self-conscious life. I'm caught between 8 chairs, not 2, 8, and I don't sit anywhere. My most authentic humanity, mine, Jonathan, is forged in communal relationships that give a room for all to work on restoring their personal integrity and human dignity. In the church of our friends, we learn that the room to exercise freedom is within a school of charity, where everyone learns from one another to first do no harm to any being, and then help one another alleviate all the harm being done to our neighbors, especially those too poor and beaten down to speak out. So Merton, the church, he's really talking about the institutional structures.
Yeah.
He's not just talking about structures like the family, all the structures are going to be gone. He's talking about the Vatican and you know, the whole. Merton was not. Merton was loved the liturgy, and at the same, he loved the office, but I think he just couldn't stand all the pomp and circumstance.
Hmm.
He never could.
Lovely.
And this is where the man was, and we all know now, because I look at this. Those of you who I can see, you're old enough to know how young he was when he died at 53. I'm 78, and 53. That man was young, and God knows what he and Dan Berrigan might have done together if he had lived
Someone's
long
going to
enough.
ask you that question coming up, but first, thanks, Jonathan. Let's go to Gordon. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Gordon Oyer, who's written a couple of
Oh, Gordon
fantastic
Oyer's here.
books on Merton.
Yeah,
And
great.
so, Gordon, I'm giving you a warning. You're going to have to do a Zoom for us one of these days.
Uh-oh.
Gordon, before you say something, tell people about the first book that you did, that you won that award for, because this is a very interesting book about the mutual influence of Merton, Dan Berrigan, and others and Jim Forrest. Tell us about that book first, and then keep going.
Okay. Yeah, the book was can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, the book was a study of a retreat that Merton hosted in the fall of 1964, where he got together a bunch of peace and social justice advocates at Gethsemane Abbey. And the book attempts to try to recreate what led to that retreat, and then also the conversations and the topics that were discussed over the course of the 3 days of that retreat. And it's called, Merton named the retreat The Spiritual Roots of Protest. And so the book is titled Pursuing the Spiritual Roots of Protest. And he was trying to get it sort of behind not the mechanics of how you do protest, but how do you ground yourself, and what are the deep roots that you sink down in, so that you can protest with the integrity that Jonathan was talking about. So that's what the book.
Great book. Get it, everybody. It's a great book. Thank you.
Yeah. Before the question, I just want to, thank you very much, Jonathan. I thought this was an excellent presentation and reflection today. Some really insightful points, and thanks, John, for getting him here, and thanks to both of you for interacting. That's great dialogue. One thing that I really appreciated was your comment, Jonathan, about Merton being a man of the margins, but also the implication through Dan Berrigan being that sometimes going to the margins is a way to create a new center. I thought that was really a profound insight. That whole concept of being on the margins is something that I've thought about, reflected on a lot. So I really appreciated that juxtaposition. And then the second thing, that exchange between individuality and community was excellent. I think that's something. So from personal background, I was raised and practiced as a Mennonite, which the idea of community is really strong, and being a separate community and a marginal community is really strong in that tradition. And so that tension between the individual and the community has always been something that I've wrestled with, and Merton has been somebody who has sort of helped me try to think through that. So again, that exchange that you're standing on your own 2 feet, but holding other people's hands, that was great imagery. So anyway, just wanted to throw that in. But anyway, my question was, early on, Jonathan, you sort of mentioned the idea of the need to value the integrity, you said, of all beings, and you didn't say just human beings, you said all beings, which led me to, sort of reminded me about non-human beings. And I guess for me, I put the question in the chat, but there's sort of a sense that these days, amongst with the specter of mass extraction and species extinction going wild around us, which in effect is cutting humanity off at the knees at the same time, the need to be nonviolent toward other creatures, toward plants, toward the land itself seems to be kind of growing more and more apparent. And so I'm wondering if you could personally reflect on that, and then also what your thoughts are in terms of the degree to which Merton saw that as well. So that's my question. Thanks, John, for the opportunity to say something.
Toward the end of his life, Merton's emphasis was on Sophia, wisdom, the feminine face of God, the mother. The mother and the feminine are foundational to understanding, I think, Thomas Merton's personality and his spirituality. Father John said he doesn't speak a lot about Jesus. He does have prayers, but he's right that he does not theologically write essays on Jesus. But Merton speaks more about the Mother of God and Sophia than anything. And this idea of the search for wisdom, the lover of wisdom is the philosopher. All contemplatives, it's not the other way around, but all contemplatives love wisdom, love integrity, love wholeness. And I want to say something before my old mind forgets to say it. I have to tell myself that I cannot be an absolutist about it and despair and say, we're never going to get there. I'm looking around at the world today. I've lived through the 60s, and now we've got this shit. We're never going to get there. Well, I tell myself this. If I'm in a cell, a jail cell, or a prison cell, and there are 3 bars on a window, and I begin filing out the first bar, and maybe it takes me my whole life just to get that one of 3 bars out. I can't get out the window, but I am free. I am working on my freedom. So we can't, I'm telling myself this, Diaz, I'm not preaching. First and foremost, I have to tell myself that you must not be discouraged any attempt that you make. If the only thing you can do is fall on your knees and hum, and you can't stand on your 2 feet and sing, you are on your way to freedom. We will always be traveling as if we don't know where we're going. At the same time, we've already arrived. It's that paradox. And how have we already arrived? Because we're moving forward. We're becoming worthy, as George Friedman says. We're making ourselves worthy together in inner work and together communal work of the peace and nonviolence, which is coming. Amen. And it is coming because we're asking it to come and we're making it come. We're filing against the bars. And before I don't share this with you, I want to share one last thing, and it fits with what we're saying. And this is by Albert Camus. Albert Camus. And let me say this, something before. This is by penultimate Emile. In Merton's journals, and this is included in the Intimate Merton, and it's a journal book that he wrote for his nurse that he fell in love with, this young woman that he fell in love with, Margie Smith. And he wrote her this, they were ending their relationship. And he wrote her this journal and he gave it to her. He called it A Midsummer Diary for M. I have never heard Merton speak like this. He says in a whole paragraph, what do I fear most? What he fears most, he says, is ignorance. There is a little lucidity, and he uses this word lucidity, which he's getting from Albert Camus, the novelist, the French novelist. There's a little lucidity in alcohol. There's a little lucidity in sex. There's a little lucidity in religion. I'm quoting him. But the real problem for me is when I narrow down lucidity to just those things. I'm looking for it instead of lucidity with a capital L. Not to be lost on one thing, not to be in one state of mind, not to say, look, I've made it, I can rest. Always pushing forward, always pushing forward, always pushing forward together. And the last thing I want to read to you is by Camus, and it's in a letter. I'm sure you've heard it. This is very famous. My dear, he says, I guess he's writing a woman. In the midst of hate, I found there was within me an invincible love. In the midst of tears, I found there was within me an invincible smile. In the midst of chaos, I found there was within me an invincible calm. I realized through it all that in the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer. And that makes me happy. For it says that no matter how hard the world pushes against me, within me, there's something stronger, something better, pushing right back.
Wow. Thank you, Jonathan. That's lovely. Marcia Kelly, I just want to ask if you wanted to share anything. You can unmute and turn on your video. Everybody, if you didn't hear me earlier, Marcia is the niece of Robert Lax, Merton's best friend, and has been on Zooms before and knew Merton. Any thoughts you want to share with Jonathan and me?
Oh, sure. Jonathan, I loved your whole talk. I loved your personal reflection in the beginning. And hearing you read from Merton, who wrote all those years ago, so interesting that it applies today. And it's the same thing with Bob Lax's writing. It's kind of timely, universal. John, I think these are just terrific sessions that you're putting together. Some of my favorite Saturdays this year, so thank you for doing that. It was a pleasure to see Jerry, who the last time I saw him was living the good life in Southern California, and to find that he's now in an orphanage in Haiti is wonderful. I know Bob and Merton would be so happy. I also see Judy Emery here, who had many conversations with Bob on the phone and on tape, and just finished a wonderful interview with the Archbishop about those conversations. So it's great to see her. And back to Jonathan, the last time I saw you was the beginning of COVID, when we had to cut short your wonderful series and gathering of the most lovely people. I guess the final thing, I don't know, some of you know Dan Riley, the Franciscan priest who started Mount Irenaeus, part of St. Bonaventure. And he's starting a center for civil discourse or conversation. called the Merton Cottage, like the cottage where they spent those summers, for civil conversation. So we'll see how that unfolds, but he's working now with me to maybe get some of the artifacts from that original cottage up on Rock City where Lax and Merton spent that time. I guess one correction, it was Sweden where the opera premiered, Philip Glass's opera. So keep your eyes open for the Swedish troops coming around the world. So great to see you all, and wonderful to hear all the comments.
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you for being here. Great. I want to move on. Unless, Jonathan, you want to say anything, I want to go on to the next question. Yeah, so my friend Carolyn Whitney Brown asks you, Jonathan. Carolyn has lived and worked with Henry Nouwen for years, who was a friend of Merton. What do you think Merton would have written if he had lived longer? Where was he headed?
I couldn't say. Merton died, and that's it. So where he was headed, I have in print, as a matter of fact, in this same paper that I quoted from about standing on your own 2 feet, that I said that we don't know what would have happened to him. Whether he would have gone to live in Alaska in a hermitage, whether he would have aligned himself with Ernesto Cardenal in Colombia, or whether I say he might have simply gotten off the bus and stopped writing and entered the silence that he loved so much. But we don't know. One thing I do know in my heart, this is simply projection. Merton's effects, his files, his journals, were in perfect shape when he left. And he left Patrick Hart, Brother Patrick Hart, as his secretary to keep all those files and journals. The only way I think Merton would have come back to Gethsemane was in a box, which is how he came back. He wasn't coming back. Gethsemane was a good mother, a good enough mother, but she pushed him out. In kindness, she pushed him out. He was moving further. We don't know where. And I don't make any myth about, oh, he had to die here. It was an accident.
Thank you, Jonathan. If I may, having known Dan so well and been a priest in religious life, Merton was old, and he was old school. And I don't think he would ever have left the monastery or Gethsemane. I mean, it was unthinkable to him. And you see that in his falling in love with the wonderful nurse. Just like Dan could never leave. And a lot of our old Jesuit friends could never leave, even though the world and life and they were changing by day. There's just something, especially in that old school priest, that doesn't exist anymore. Merton was a tough old school guy before he met the nurse. That's what Patrick told me. But all I'm saying is, did you know the great nun? I'm having the senior moment from Miriam from the Trappistine Monastery. Yeah, where Merton was,
right,
just on the way to Asia. He was going to come back and spend Lent there. Yeah, she's telling me that he was going to live in Northern California one way or the other on the coast there in a hermitage and stop writing. That makes sense to me. And the other weird thing is, having known so many monks and visited monasteries, I go to monasteries almost every month and right now. And all my life, they're not what you think. Monks do get up and go. And I don't understand that. And they
Well,
leave for many years and then they come back. And
yes.
they're not faced with it. That's why I think Merton was going to come back. He was
Well,
a,
I think
he
he
was
would.
a priest.
I say this, and this is just an opinion. This is not gospel. Merton would never have legally left Gethsemane. He would always have been a monk of Gethsemane, but he would have been on the road in some way,
Yeah,
even if
probably.
that road was a hermitage where he wasn't writing.
Yeah.
I don't think he could have ever stopped. I'm writing a play where I'm having Merton in the last act. He's tempted to not write again. A Buddhist nun tells him, "Stop writing." He's tempted, but I don't think he would have ever stopped.
It's so great.
Writing for him was a form of being alive, a prayer, really. So I don't know that he would have ever stopped writing. And I don't know whether he would have ever lasted long in a hermitage. I've said to myself, and only to myself,
Yeah.
that if Merton had, when he was in Asia, and said, "Oh, I ought to be take up with one of these lamas, these masters, and learn from them," I have said to myself, yeah. And if the lama had told him, the first thing you're going to have to do when you're studying with me is I don't want you to write a word for a year, Merton would have lasted a month.
Yeah.
Bye. Bye.
Yeah. It's also rich and fascinating and interesting. And I love how you called us as Advent eschatological faith to that inner freedom. And I notice our time is up, and we didn't even get to hear from you, Jerry, or Jenny, or John, all my other friends. Jerry, I'll give you the last word, but Jonathan, remember Merton's last words, apparently, according to Jim Forrest's early version of his biography. The nun comes up and complains to him as he's leaving the room where he's just given the talk on standing on your own 2 feet. She says, "You never talked about Christ and witnessing to Christ. What the hell is that? Are you talking about communism?" And Merton says, "We're not so much to talk about Christ as live so that everybody can see Christ within us. The goal is," it's shocking. This is what I heard you call us to today. Merton's last phrase where he said to the nun, "The goal is total inner transformation." What a phrase. What a thing to say. And that's a good note to die on. Jerry, you have a last word for Jonathan? Because we're and some who want to stay can stay on, but unmute yourself, Jerry, from Haiti, who's just written a book on Merton.
Yeah, I just want to say I was so happy to see Marcia. A couple of weeks ago, this picture fell out of a book I was moving, and it's Marcia and Jack and Mike Chiarello up at the cottage when I used to go up to St. Bonaventure's a lot to give talks. But at any rate, what I really wanted to say something that Jonathan mentioned in his talk was that I live on the margins in Haiti, but I couldn't have survived such a harsh, violent environment without any of the normal comforts such as electricity and plumbing and hot water, without spending the first 2 hours of every day working on my own personal inner stuff. And I would do that simply by reading, by writing and praying and just shutting everything out for 2 hours. So I think you can't do any kind of action without being grounded in that kind of inner space where you're taking care of your own inner business.
Thank you so much, Jerry. So everybody, really thank you for being with us. I know it just feels like we just got started. And Jonathan, it was a great blessing to listen to you and have us have you with us. As John Yusenchuk writes, it was a perfect Advent meditation. I'm happy to stay on and chat with anybody who wants to. Jonathan has to go. If I might just give a little commercial announcement and then we'll end. The next Zoom is by Jonathan Eeg, who just published this 1,000-page biography of Martin Luther King. It's incredible that he's going to do it with our little Zoom. And it's a New York Times bestseller. And I'm very bombastic, as you know. I think I've read everything Martin Luther King wrote. And like Merton and Gandhi. And I learned so much. If you want to, for Christmas, to go to your library and get a copy or buy a copy if you like Martin Luther King, or please join us. It's Saturday, January 6th. It's like having Michael Mott, who wrote the first best biography of Merton, to have this great man. There's only two, in my opinion, great other biographies of Dr. King, and they came out in the early 80s. And this has all new stuff. Please join us. And then there are other Zooms. I'm going to do a 3-week Zoom in Lent on my new book, The Gospel of Peace. And I'll be hitting the road in 3 or 4 weeks, be traveling the country for 5 months. And I hope to see many of you along the way. Please write and stay in touch with me, everybody. And please do me a favor and try to support the Beatitudes Center as best you can by telling people about it. That would help me the most. Let's end with a little 2-second prayer, because this was so deep to have Jonathan here reflecting on Merton. So again, we just turn to God and we take a moment to give thanks for our time together and for Jonathan's wisdom and sharing on Merton and his wisdom. And so we say, beloved God of peace, thank you for our time together. Thank you for the life and witness of Thomas Merton. Bless us as we go forth, that we might be your holy Advent people and live out Jonathan's encouragement to be contemplatives, a people of Advent eschatological faith, to have that holy longing for the coming of Christ, and to stand onto our own 2 feet, and also to reach out for others for help and live in community as we do that. That we might be people of nonviolence and peace and compassion and eschatological universal love for the rest of our lives. We ask this mighty blessing in Jesus' name. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Jonathan, for being here. And we'll see you all the next time. And I'm going to turn off the recording now. So God bless everybody and take care, and see you the next time.